Welcome to Collect All in Wave. I'm Hot Wobble, and today we're going to learn how to use the Brainworx SSL 4000G console. I know when I first got this kind of channel strip or this kind of plugin, I was super intimidated because I was coming from very graphic EQs, like some of the stock stuff, or something like a Fab Filter plugin where there's a more visual representation. This was all very intimidating to me, and I just want to help you cut through some of that and get to using it. So we're going to go through every knob, every button, explain what it's actually doing and what it would be useful for. Here are the filters. They're up first. We have a high pass filter, which is going to filter out whatever is below this frequency. It lets the highs pass through only, but not the lows. Whereas a low pass filter does the opposite. We're trimming off the top. It's letting everything below a certain frequency pass through. And we can change the frequency by hitting this button up here. Right now, all the way open, it's at 22K, 22,000 hertz. If we hit divide by 3, now it's much lower. It's at 7.3K. Similarly with the low pass filter, right? This is at 16 hertz, and then we multiply by 3. Now it's at 48. So you can shift around the frequency that these things are active at. And then this DYNSC thing, basically what this is doing is sending the filters to the input of the dynamic stage. So you can use these to shape what is hitting your dynamics part of the plugin. This is really helpful, say, if you had like a kick drum that you wanted to not have that engage the compressor to make it less pumpy. There's also a feature that's built in to do that. But here you have two filters which let you shape exactly what's hitting that dynamics part of the plugin. Just while we're stopped here, also a quick mixing trick just to plant the seed, see what you do with it. I always thought filters were super boring. I always thought of it as like this kind of utilitarian tool that you used to just clean stuff up and move on. But you can use it as a creative effect too. Like one common thing that you'll see in mixing especially is when you take something out with one plugin and then put it back with another one. So reduce with something and then replace with something else. So one trick that you'll use, not often on like a full mix, but often on a part of something like a drum part or a vocal or a keyboard, is you take stuff out with, say, a filter. Like here I'm filtering everything from 6.1K and above, and then you put it back with the EQ. This helps bring some of the vibe of the EQ to that part and give it more character. So here's nothing. And then with it. So it does something. That's just a creative effect to try out. But that being said, let's move on to the next part of the plugin. Next up, we have the compressor. So first of all, if we hit this link button, and let me just set this up. This is not going to tell the compressor to make things mono. It just compresses things at the same time. So if either channel triggers it, it's going to compress as one. Well, I'm going to leave this on stereo for now. Then we have the threshold control. This basically says, like, when do we want the compressor to engage? If we turn it down, you see how it starts hitting a lot sooner, whereas if we bring the threshold up, it's much lighter. It's going to wait till that level is higher before it does anything. Then we have the ratio. This is just how much does it compress by. Is it going to be a little bit? Is it going to be, I believe 2 to 1 is going to be 2 dB of compression for every decibel that is over the threshold. I think I got my numbers right on that one. Honestly, I don't think about it too much. I just go by ear. So I'll just listen and I try to find the right amount of smush that feels good. And then down here we have the release. So this is how quick is this thing gonna let go. You're gonna wanna play around with the release time on a lot of things, especially drums, because if that compressor gets triggered, I usually want the release time to be fast enough that it lets go all the way before the next drum hit happens. So some of this is going to be dependent on the tempo of the song or how busy the part actually is. What I don't want is this, right? A really slow release time. So once this compressor triggers, it stays triggered for the next couple of notes. I usually do not want to get that kind of sound. Now be careful with this little F LED or the double click on this. What's happening here is you're not changing the release, you're actually changing the attack time. So by default, I don't know exactly offhand what the attack time is, but there's some kind of preset attack time that's happening. Or it's an automatic attack. It might be dependent on the source material. But then if we hit this button, it's going to switch to a fast attack time. Again, I don't think about it too much. I just toggle back and forth and see which one sounds closer to what I want on that particular part. Sometimes I like a fast attack time with a little bit less compression. Other times I want a little bit more with the slower or the pre-programmed attack time. This little screw looking thing down here is really handy. This is a parallel mix knob. So this lets you mix the compressed signal with the dry signal. One common technique I will use, that I'm sure I used in this track when I mixed it, was you compress something pretty hard, like 6 or 7 ratios pretty hard, as you can see, right? And then we just mix in a little bit of that. So here's totally smashed. Let's just bring in a little bit. So it basically just helps add some fullness without making it sound totally smushed and smashed, because we still have those transients dancing on top of the really hard hit compressed signal. This control right here, HPF, is the built-in high-pass filter. This is a good one to play with, especially if you're using something with a lot of low-end kick drum kind of energy, because sometimes what'll happen, there's going to be more energy in your low end if you want it to sound full and bassy. So sometimes that will sort of prematurely trigger the compressor, and it'll just give it that kind of pumpy, not over-compressed kind of sound is how I would describe it. So what you can do is you just filter out some of the low end from only the input of the compressor, and just get rid of that kick drum or that bass or whatever might be triggering it. Usually a good setting for this to try around is plus or minus 100 hertz. I might go down to like 80 or 60 or as high as like 130, just to get that glue that happens on the higher end elements and give it that fullness without the overcompressed sound of a kick drum artificially pumping the hell out of things. The other thing here, we have this release 2 control. The manual isn't super specific about what this is actually doing, but it modifies the release time to just get rid of some of the pumpiness that happens. The manual says on delicate acoustic tracks. Honestly, I play with this all the time just to get the back ends of stuff shaped the right way. Again, I'm almost exclusively, I'm not looking at a meter when I do this. This is all by ear. And it's one thing you just have to get used to with using these kinds of plugins, is it really forces you to use your ear instead of looking at what's happening on a graph, like what you would get in some of the, like a stock EQ plugin. Below the compressor, we have the expander section. If you don't know what an expander is, it's kind of the opposite of a compressor. It increases the difference between the louder parts of the signal and the quieter parts of the signal. I'll be the first one to admit, for a long time, I never used these. I had no idea why you would use one. The reason you would want to use one, I would say, is often to clean up the back of notes. You can actually make things more uniform or just help things get out of the way faster. So if we're going to use this expander, because this is pretty compressed, I'm going to have to set up the threshold here so you can start doing something, right? This knob, again, is the threshold at which things start happening. If I have it at negative 60, this track is going to be way above that, so it's not going to do anything. But if I have it at negative 20, we will see something happen. And you see how as things get quieter, it starts to creep up in here? So it's basically just turning down the volume of the quieter parts of the note. Right here we have this minus 30 button, which is shifting the range of the whole threshold knob down by 30 dB, I believe. That's what I assume it would mean, right? And then if we disengage that, watch what happens. Now we have a much higher range. So the idea is you can tailor the range of this knob to be appropriate for whatever the range of the audio you're sending into it is. Here we have the range of the expander, which is basically saying, hey, how much do you want to expand by? It's kind of analogous to the ratio knob on a compressor. So if we turn this down, it's going to do it'll make less of a difference between the highs and lows. See here, it's only doing a little bit. If we turn this up, now it's doing a lot. It's pretty simple. Here we have the release time. Again, very similar to the release time on the compressor. Again, there's this little F knob like on the compressor, which does more or less the same thing. It modifies the attack time from this automatic attack time to a fast attack time. Then, if we go to this button, the EXP button, it turns into a gate. So now instead of expanding the dynamic range, it's going to cut off the quieter parts. This is something that you would often use on acoustic drums where you want to cut out some of the ring from other drums. Or if there's just something going on where you like at a vocal is another good example, where you want the actual vocal part, but you want to cut off some of the breathing or some of the background noise. Any of that kind of stuff would be a good time to use a gate. So if we set this up, check out the difference. It's cutting things off a lot harder. And here we have this hysteresis button, which is going to This was always funny for me to wrap my head around. It's changing the difference between, like with this at 0, the threshold is setting the point at which the gate opens and which the gate closes. Okay? Now, if you turn up this hysteresis knob, what it's going to do is, see how it says it's a minus value, minus 6.3 dB? It's going to say that the place at which the gate opens and closes is now different. So the reason you would use this is usually to reduce gate chatter. So in other words, you want a really loud signal to open the gate. But then sometimes it'll start to chatter. It'll cut off the backs of notes when you don't want it to. So you can say, hey, gate open on the really loud thing, but then don't close quite so fast on the way down. So we're setting the point at which the gate closes to be lower than when it opens. That's all this is really doing. See, now we have like some chattery stuff. Let me see if we can get rid of that. See how with the hysteresis set at 0, it's a lot more like jittery? You can help tame some of that by lowering that threshold at which it closes. Then we have this button, which basically inverts the whole thing. So this is a normal gate. When something exceeds the threshold, it opens, and then it closes on the way down. This is going to be the opposite of that. So in other words, it's going to let things through, and then when that threshold is exceeded, it closes the gate. I don't use this a ton, but occasionally there's like a weird situation where it comes up where you would want to do this. It's just good to know that it's there. Down here, we just have a couple buttons. This DYN button, that just turns the whole dynamic section on or off. So, good to know. I guess not super necessary. They could have just built that into like a threshold knob or something, but they're trying to reproduce the console and make it familiar for people who have used the console for a long time. There's not much more to say about that. Here, this is kind of cool. It lets you swap out a different model. So here you're using the dynamic section from the G series console, and then you could flip it to the E series console. That's kind of cool. Sometimes they sound a little bit different. Sometimes I can't really tell the difference, but I'll just flip back and forth and be like, oh, okay, this one sounds better, and move on. Usually I'm moving kind of quick with that kind of thing. Now over, one more thing before we get to that, this key thing. A key is when it's basically a sidechain. So you can input another signal from another track into this and say, hey, dynamic section, I want you to only respond to the sidechain input or the key input. I would always get really confused because here you have sidechain filters that affect this. And then you have keying, which some people also refer to as side chaining. I always find that super fucking confusing, and I wish people would be consistent in the way that they refer to these things, but that's just one of those things you got to know. So when people talk about like side chaining to a synth or a kick drum, in this plugin or a lot of these channel strip things, they call it a key. And the way that you set up keying is different depending on your DAW. I'm in Reaper, but the way you would do it here versus Logic or Ableton or FL or any of the other big ones, it's going to be different. So I would need to do a specific video on each DAW to explain that. But that's already pretty well covered on YouTube, so I'm not going to get into how to set up the key here. The EQ section might be a little bit more intuitive, but let's just go through it anyway. So we have the high shelf up here in the pink. We have the low shelf in the gray down here. All this is going to do, we select the frequency that we want to boost above. So here, if we started around 5.1K, now it gets brighter. We boost on top. Okay, cool. Same thing with the low shelf. If we go at around 100 hertz, 94, whatever this is, and we boost, it's going to boost everything below that. And it can boost quite a lot, which is sometimes, often, very helpful. Then we have our mid-range frequencies. So over here, we're going to be able to set how much we're boosting by, where we're boosting. So let me put this 2.3, okay. Then boosting. And then here, we're going to set the width of how much that boost is going to happen. So as we go this direction, the Q is going to go down in terms of the number, and the boost is going to be bigger. It's boosting a bigger chunk of the signal. Very obvious. Then if we go here, it's going to narrow. Let's turn this way up so you can hear. So then we have our low mid-range, which works the exact same way. Again, how much we're boosting by, what the frequency we're boosting at, and then the width of the boost, the Q. One thing that's cool about this is you can change the EQ type. I guess there was different versions of the EQ over the years, so you can swap between them. And if we flip over to the orange EQ, the orange version, this is kind of cool because now instead of having just a straight shelf in the bottom, that's what it is by default, you can change it to a bell. So this will have the same shape as your mid-range EQ bands. And then we have these times 3, at least in this EQ mode, we have times 3. So this is going to affect the frequency. Like you see here, it's at 3.4, but if we turn this off, now it's at 1.1. And then same thing here, it's just like the filters, right? So here we have, it's 304 with it engaged, the divided by, and if we turn this off, now it's back to 913. So you can shift the range of the mid-range bands around using these things. Buttons, this is just the EQ on-off button, super boring. The two next to it are not super boring. So we have the pre-DYN. All this is going to do is take the EQ section and put it before the compression and the expander and all that stuff. This can really change what's happening because you're changing what gets fed into the compressor to begin with. The default is, with this off, is all your EQ happens after the compression and your expansion. So that's pretty important. This can make a really big difference depending on what you're trying to do. Now this DYN SC thing, when I looked in the manual, it didn't make a ton of sense to me because I was like, it just says it puts it in the side chain. It puts the EQ in the side chain. So I was like, what does that mean? How I think of this is you're using the EQ to shape where this compressor, for example, is the most sensitive. So for example's sake, if we turn this on and we crank up the low end, you see how the compressor is hitting way harder on those kick drums? It's because you're making the compressor more sensitive to the activity happening in the low end. Whereas if we do the inverse, it's not really doing that much at all when the kick drum hits. Right, so similarly, we can do the same thing for the high end. We could take all that out and make this all about mid-range. And you hear how this isn't really changing. It's not shaping the character like an EQ would. We turn this off. Now we hear like a big filtering change. We hear a big difference. So by hitting this button, we can change how this compressor responds. And this is frankly this is kind of the reason to use a channel strip plugin. Like, yeah, it's nice to have good EQs and good compression and stuff all in one place, some saturation, but being able to have all this routing just sort of taken care of, to do that with individual plugins is a pain in the ass, frankly. So it's good to have all this just in one place as like a little package that you can open up and control all this stuff right off the jump. And then if you want to do some EQ shaping after this with like a fab filter plugin or something like that, then of course you can do that. But this is a big deal. Just these two buttons let you change a bunch of things. And on to some of the more Brainworx specific stuff and metering and things like that. Here we just have an in-out meter. Right now they're set to monitor the output, or you can hit this little triangle-y thing and it changes it to input monitoring. All right, easy. I've pointed to it a couple times already, but here we have the metering for your expander, how much it's expanding by. Similarly, your limiting and compression metering right here. Then, we have our volume slider. This is going to adjust our output level. Here, where it says in-gain, we can adjust the input level. I'll often use this to just level match something across a whole mix as I'm getting things set up. That's very handy just to have ready to go. This V-gain thing is basically how much analog noise is going to get introduced into the signal. This is a Brainworx analog console emulation thing. Any piece of analog gear is going to have a little bit of noise in it just by default. So this is saying how much do you want to feed into the signal. This does make a difference. So I would recommend playing around with that. You can add in quite a bit or none at all. It's really your call. And then here we have this TMT stuff. This is tolerance modeling technology. This is like Brainworx's thing. Basically what this is when you have a big analog console, each one of the individual electrical components, like the resistors and the capacitors and all the parts that go into it, they're made to a tolerance. So in other words, each one of those pieces is not exactly the same. And when they're building something like that, they measure all of them to make sure they're within a certain range of tolerance. In other words, if a piece is like way out of range, they just don't use it because that's going to screw up the piece of gear. But so there's a range, and you can never get it perfect. They just try to say, hey, it's got to be within this range, and then we use it or we don't. And what this is doing across a big format console, like a 72-channel console, it equates to little differences from channel to channel. Channel 1 and 2 is not going to sound exactly like channel 2 and 3. There's going to be little differences. So Brainworx has this thing where they model that, and you could spread this out across a whole mix to mimic the vibe of a big console, but do it in the computer. You can turn that on or off here, so you can have just like a straight digital kind of thing happening, versus this analog thing, which I believe is also going to control some of the noise that gets added and that kind of stuff. And you can scroll through these and find a set of channels that sounds good to you. They do sound a little bit different. It is subtle, but it does work. There is something there. I have another video that I could link to, it's probably in a card or description, where I talk about how this affects the stereo field in a pretty profound way. But anyway, you can hit this button and assign a random channel, or you can hit this button and it'll give you a warning, and it assigns every channel strip in the whole session to a random channel. So that's just good to know that that's there. Boring stuff, we have a mute switch. Does exactly what you think it does. We have a phase flip switch. This can be handy when you're dealing with a lot of acoustic sources like a drum kit or something. Here we have this Thd Adjustment screw. This is total harmonic distortion. So this is just going to add some saturation on this channel. You can turn that all the way off or add a decent amount of it. And then if you go up here, we have corresponding controls, but for the whole kit and caboodle for everything. So here you can adjust THD for all channels. And again, it gives you a warning. You can turn it off if you like. But this is helpful. All right, don't show me again. I'm done. So you can adjust this for every channel in the session that's using this plugin. Same thing with this V-gain, which again is just the analog noise. Here we can solo just the mid-range, or not mid-range, the mid-band. This is a stereo thing. Again, Brainworx is all about mid-side control. So if you just want to listen to stereo information, you hit this, you hit the side. This is just mid information. And then moving on, here you can just control the size of the interface. I have it nice and big so you can see what's going on. Here we have a forward and back button. So say you make some changes. All right, just say we do some stuff and you want to go back a step, you hit that. And you can go back in time, or you can go forward in time to redo what you just did. These A, B, C, and D controls are really helpful. So if maybe you want to say, hey, what's this setting sound like versus another one? You set A up to this, then you go to B, change a bunch of stuff around to the other setting that you want. And then say C, let's try another one. Let's do this. I'm just turning knobs right now. And then you can flip between all of these different settings and see what appeals the most to your ears. And then you can copy and paste settings between instances of the plugin. That's what this is for. Or you could just reset and start over from the beginning. All right, people, you have made it to the end. That is every button and every knob in this plugin. I hope you have a better idea of how to use channel strip plugins or why you might use one just in general. There's many of them out there that are very good. And if you like what I'm doing, of course, you can subscribe. I will be doing more videos. If you really like what I'm doing, I have a Patreon where you can just support the content. You can get access to subscriber stuff. I give away free sounds there. And there's also an option to work directly with me so I can help you just in your journey and understanding this stuff and just upping the level of your game. So that's all in the description. Check it out. And this video is over. I will see you at the next one.